The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, also known as COSO, issued its updated Internal Control Integrated Framework in May 2013. COSO will continue to make its original framework available during the transition period ending December 15, 2014, after which time COSO will consider it as having been superseded. Accordingly, SEC registrants that are subject to management or external auditor reporting requirements relating to internal control over financial reporting, or ICFR, should use the 2013 framework for reporting periods ending on or after December 15, 2014. These companies will herein be referred to as registrants. Registrants should monitor statements made by the SEC for their views regarding transition. If the original framework has been appropriately applied to the registrant's ICFR, transition to the 2013 framework should not result in significant changes in the design of internal control. However, registrants will need to assess and document how its design of ICFR is in accordance with the 2013 framework. We suggest completing a thoughtful assessment soon to help management prepare for the transition and the external auditor plan for the 2014 integrated audit. The original framework requires all 5 components of internal control: control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities be present and functioning for a system of internal control to be effective. For ICFR, present generally refers to the design of controls, and functioning refers to the operating effectiveness of controls. The original framework further describes these 5 components of internal control as interrelated. The 2013 framework retains these criteria and formalizes other concepts discussed in the original framework as additional requirements for a system of internal control to be effective, as shown in the pyramid. Principles are fundamental concepts associated with components of internal control. These concepts were included in the original framework and in COSO's 2006 ICFR, Guidance for Smaller Public Companies. The 2013 framework explicitly states these concepts as 17 principles that must be present and functioning to demonstrate that each of the 5 components of internal control is present and functioning. The 2013 framework does not fundamentally change what is required for effective internal control. Based on a 2011 survey of users of the original framework, COSO determined that the requirements for effective internal control have been more difficult to apply to the softer components, namely the control environment, risk assessment, information and communication, and monitoring activities. Accordingly, the articulation of 14 principles associated with these components may enhance a registrant's ability to identify and document relevant controls. For these softer components and associated principles, relevant controls typically include indirect entity-level controls, or indirect ELCs. Indirect ELCs vary in nature and have an indirect effect on the likelihood that a misstatement will be detected or prevented on a timely basis. Indirect ELCs are designed to operate throughout the organization and often have a pervasive impact on ICFR. Determining whether controls are designed to satisfy a registrant's determination that a principle is present is a matter of management judgment. In designing indirect ELCs, management or internal audit should evaluate the following. Does the indirect ELC cover relevant subunits of the organization, such as divisions, subsidiaries, operating units, and functions? What is the objective of the control, and what procedures are performed to meet the control objective? Does the individual performing the control have the necessary authority and competence to execute the control? What is the frequency of the operation of the control? The transition to the 2013 framework should not impact the design of direct ELCs, review controls, or transaction-level controls, such as three-way match or cash reconciliations, that support the control activities component of internal control. To help a registrant develop a plan to transition ICFR to the 2013 framework in 2014, PwC recommends a 4-phased approach. In the first phase, management and internal auditors become familiar with the 2013 framework and initiate dialogue with audit committees and senior management about potential implications of the 2013 framework. Training sessions on the 2013 framework may also be helpful. In the second phase, management or internal auditors conduct a preliminary assessment. This will help registrants document their understanding of the design of indirect ELCs to demonstrate the principles are present and determine whether there are any gaps in design or in documentation. This assessment will also help management estimate incremental time necessary to analyze and document the transition to the 2013 framework. Once the preliminary assessment is complete and any gaps in design have been identified, registrants should move on to Phase 3 to perform a comprehensive assessment of the operating effectiveness of indirect ELCs. In this phase, identify necessary changes in the operation of indirect ELCs or related SOX documentation necessary to demonstrate these components of internal control and associated principles are functioning. This assessment helps finalize the development of an action plan to make any necessary changes. In Phase 4, registrants execute their action plan, remediating any internal control deficiencies or SOX documentation identified as a result of the assessment. Let's talk more about Phase 2, the part of the transition plan that registrants should complete over the next few months. Mapping existing indirect ELCs to the principles associated with the softer components of internal control will help identify areas that require attention. PwC's generic mapping template and related guidance can facilitate this exercise. The template lays out a 5-step process. Let's discuss each of these 5 steps in detail and highlight how the mapping template facilitates execution of these steps. We will use Principle 1, relating to the control environment, as our example as we walk through the template. Step 1. Affirm the 17 principles are relevant. As a reminder, the 2013 framework states that the principles are suitable and presumed relevant for all entities. Even though the framework indicates that there may be a rare industry, operating, or regulatory situation in which management has determined that a principle is not relevant to a component of internal control, we believe all principles are relevant for SEC registrants. Step 2. Identify points of focus relevant to each principle. The 2013 framework describes points of focus as important characteristics of each of the 17 principles. Points of focus are not requirements for effective internal control, but can help management understand important characteristics of the principles in mapping existing controls. The points of focus are included in the template as a recommended starting point to help management execute where, i.e. corporate subunits, and how, i.e. design consistency, indirect ELCs operate throughout the entire organization to support their determination that each relevant principle is present. Management may use COSO's points of focus as presented in the template, modify them as appropriate, or use others to describe important characteristics of each principle. Step 3. Map each principle to existing indirect ELCs, considering relevant points of focus. Registrants will use existing control documentation to perform the mapping of principles to the indirect ELCs operating throughout the entire organization. The design and documentation of indirect ELCs should include the objective, subunit location, personnel, frequency, and specific procedures performed. Step 4. Identify gaps in the design of indirect ELCs and related documentation. The determination of whether a principle is present is a matter of management judgment. The assessment of existing indirect ELCs against the principles might reveal 2 types of gaps, including 1. Controls are not designed to demonstrate that a principle is present, or 2. Controls associated with a principle exist, but the controls are not included in a company's existing documentation of internal control over financial reporting. As discussed earlier, management or internal audit should evaluate the who, what, when, and where questions in connection with assessing the design of indirect ELCs. It is also important to note that the criteria for assessing the severity of internal control deficiencies and the terminology for describing them will continue to follow existing SEC rules and regulations. Step 5. Develop initial estimate of any incremental effort required for transition. The template includes a tab titled Gap Log, designed to capture all design and/or documentation gaps and develop an action plan, including responsible party and due date to ensure any identified gaps are remediated timely. It is important to note that the Gap Log does not replace the summary of aggregated deficiencies. Instead, it's a project management tool designed to help management and internal auditors identify design and documentation gaps and set out actions required for timely remediation. As registrants determine any necessary changes in the design of controls or SOX documentation over the next few months, management should communicate potential significant changes in the registrant's system of internal control over financial reporting to senior management and the audit committee. Registrants should also discuss the results of their preliminary assessment with their external auditor. Please contact your PwC engagement team to obtain a copy of PwC's Phase 2 mapping template and for questions you have concerning your recently updated COSO internal control integrated framework. You can also obtain additional insight and perspective from relevant PwC publications available on CFO Direct, including 10 Minutes on Why the COSO Update Deserves Your Attention, Dataline 2013-09, COSO Issues Updated Internal Control Integrated Framework, and related illustrative documents. Quarter Close Video, How Companies Should Address the New COSO Framework in Their Internal Control Process.